I had mentioned that the appellation of Elohim, which means Almighty, according to the Sepharno, which one of the commentators on the Torah explains, is the plural of Kale. Kale means power. It's one of the unpronounceable names of God. Kale means power. Angels are referred to as Elim. As we said, as the Jewish people, after the sea closed on the Egyptians, they said the song at the sea, and they said, Micha mocha be'elim Hashem. Who is the equivalent of you among all the powerful ones? Who are the Elim? Elim referring to the angels. Meaning every angel is created for a specific mission, and in regard to that mission, he has power. But there, the power is defined by the mission. God is Elohim. He's the Almighty. You have endless angels, each one having its specific value and purpose and objective, but that's limited and defined by the objective. God being the empowerer, he's Almighty. He possesses all might. Whatever conceivably exists, it all emanates from him. That's Almighty. Rambam writes in the laws of the fundamentals of Jewish belief, fundamentals of Torah, that in terms of any creation, let's first start with the human being. Human being, we have limbs, we have internal organs, we have a brain, and every part of the brain has a different function. You have the brain, which has retention. You have part of the brain, which is emotion. So each part of the brain has various functions, each one complementing the other one, supporting the other. The sum totality of all the various components of the person is the totality of the person. So each ability emanates from another component of what the person is. Now, an angel has a form, has a profile within the spiritual realm, because everything is finite. Once you say something's finite, it has a profile. What's its profile? It's a spiritual profile, but it's a profile, because limitation means if it's not infinite, it is contained up to a point. God is infinite. God has no profile because God is unlimited. He's the totality of everything. God's ability, it's not one aspect of him expresses one thing, another aspect of him expresses something else. Everything emanates from his one entity, which is one. It's not power comes from this part of him and that, because automatically saying that he's compartmentalized within himself. He's the totality of everything. Everything emanates from him. The way it expresses itself, it's defined in components, in finite, endless finite individual existence, which each one has its value and its purpose and its objective. So when we speak about a body, what is a body? We say regarding in the Yigdal, Elo guf velo dumusa guf. He has no body. He doesn't even have a semblance of a body. A body means an identity. You know, you speak to people, they say, how to visualize God? Many people who don't know, they say, well, we visualize God as light. God is not light. God illuminates, but he's not light. Well, I visualize, whatever you visualize, you can't visualize God. Firstly, you can't visualize him because there's no frame of reference of what God is. Could you visualize an angel? The only reason why we know what an angel looks like, when it manifests itself in the physical, because when a prophet prophesies, he has a vision. So the angel, who's a spiritual being, appears as the Rambam says, as a young child with wings. That's the way the prophet visualizes in this vision of prophecy, but that's only a manifestation, but that's not what the angel looks like. That's so the prophet should be able to relate to the angel who's communicating with him. But that's not the form of the angel. The angel has the form, but it's a spiritual form. But because our faculties only allow us to process things within the physical realm, not within the spiritual realm, therefore he has to visualize it in the physical. So the angel has to manifest himself in the vision as this child with wings, because each aspect of that angel has significance in terms of communicating, representing something. That's the idea. So let's talk about the third fundamental of Jewish belief. Ani mamin b'emunah shleimo, I believe with absolute belief. Shebar yisborach shmo eino guf. He's not a body. Whatever you want to call it. He's 6 million miles by 6 million miles, but that's a body. V'lo yasigeu masige aguf. And whatever any entity is subject to, he's not subject to that. He cannot be affected. Anything that exists is this cause and effect, could be affected. God cannot be affected by anything. Why can't God be affected by anything? Because God is the effector. He's not affected by anything. Because all existence, as we explained, is ex nihilo. Everything emanates from him. He's not dependent on anything, but everything's dependent on him, because if he would cease to will, whatever he willed would no longer exist, and it would revert back to the ex nihilo state. As a result of that, he's not a body. Body automatically interprets itself as finite. In addition, he's not subject to that. Because he's infinite, therefore he's not subject to whatever any finite being, spiritual, physical being is subject to. Because even the angel, if the angel exists within something else, that means he came about, because there's something besides the angel. There's nothing outside of God. So therefore the angel could be affected. How could he be affected? By something outside of him, which exists outside of him. Nothing exists outside of God. Because God is everything, because everything emanates from God. And as a result of that, lo shum dimion klal. There's nothing in the farthest reaches of anything that has any semblance of what God is. Because nothing is infinite, only God. And you can't even fathom what he is, because anything that exists outside of him is what? Is finite. So finite cannot fathom infinite, and infinite means he's not subject to anything, because nothing's outside of himself. He's the one who causes everything. That's the understanding. We find in the Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu was the most special Jew who ever walked the face of the earth. He's the most humble human being who ever walked the face of the earth. He was the conduit. He was chosen by God, firstly, to be the Redeemer, to take the Jews out of Egypt. And the objective of that was to bring them to a level and to guide them and lead them, that they should achieve a level of capacity, that they should be able to stand at Sinai once the Exodus takes place, to be able to declare Naseh v'Nishma. We accept unequivocally the word of God, to become God's people. He was the conduit for the Torah to be communicated through him to the Jewish people. He brought down the first set of tablets, which were created by God, which were etched by God. Moshe spent 40 days and 40 nights studying Torah from God in a setting which was a total spiritual setting. a setting where only angels exist. But that's what Moshe was. And he studied Torah directly from God. The Torah tells us Moshe Rabbeinu passed away on the day he was born, when he was exactly 120 years old. And the Torah goes to describe, gives us a description of his physical state, his physical condition. Lo noslecho. His vibrancy was not diminished as much as Nayota. He had the vibrancy of a young person. Lo kos eno. His eyesight was perfect. Was not in any way dimmed. He had the physicality of a young person. Even to the point, Rashi cites the Midrash, afilu bekever. Even in the grave, it was lo noslecho. His vibrancy was there, and every aspect of his being was fully functional, even in the grave, although he passed away. Meaning the body didn't decompose or diminish. It's if he was a vibrant human being, even when he was no longer alive. How do we understand this? And firstly, there's another question, which the Maharal of Prague asks. I mean, since when is the Torah giving us a physical update of Moshe's condition when he passes away and after he passes away? What relevance does this have to anything? You want to say he's the most humble person who ever walked the face of the earth. He's the greatest prophet who ever lived. He received the Torah on behalf of the Jewish people. He's God's spokesman. Okay, that's all relevant to us. But that his physical condition was, that even the day he died, and even the grave, he didn't decompose as much as Nayota. And he was vibrant, and his eyesight was perfect. What's the takeaway? Why is that important for us to know? So the Maharal of Prague explains, why didn't Moshe Rabbeinu age in terms of, he looked like an older person, but he did not age. He had a long white beard. That's explicit in the Midrash, but he did not age. What is important for us to know? He did not age. Now, what is the aging process? What's any process? When something comes into existence, over time, it is affected by its environment. You know, if you have a fresh piece of bread and you don't somehow seal it with a sealant, what's going to happen to it? It starts getting stale, and eventually it gets moldy. And eventually, it actually becomes granular, and eventually turns to dust. Why? Because it's exposed to the air and to the elements, and that causes it to decompose and revert back to dust. Although not much before it was a fresh piece of bread, but everything in existence is that. Person's born, advances, wanes, and passes away. What is that called? That's called cause and effect. There's cause and effect. The greatest impact that life has on a human being are his actions and his environment. You know, there's an expression, if you burn the candle at both ends, you actually age prematurely. They used to say to the president of the United States that at 4 years of presidency, he would age 20 years. That was the level of stress and responsibility he had during that 4-year period. So the premature aging process, or expediting it, is due to the external pressures and involvements that the president, that office actually entails. So everything's cause and effect. What about if you lived a life of cause but not effect? You cause, but you're not affected. You're only an effector, you're never affected. If that's the case, you know what that's called? That's called a spiritual being. Although your physical context, your physical body, but if you're never affected, you're not subject to the effect of anything physical. So when the Torah tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu, his vibrancy was of a young person, his eyesight was not diminished, but he lived in the real world, but the world had no relevance to him. He affected the world. The world did not affect him. He was an unaffected being. That's what the Torah is telling us. He's unaffected. And because he's unaffected, therefore, he did not age, he did not diminish, he did not decompose even in the grave. Because the decomposition process, even the grave, is you're affected by the location. You're affected by the maggots, by the worms. But they can't, because Moshe Rabbeinu in his life never lived a life where he was affected. Even after he dies, his body cannot be affected, because that's what it represents. He's an unaffected person. It's very interesting. Who is God? God is an unaffected being. He affects, he's unaffected. Therefore, whatever happens to anything that exists cannot happen to God. He is the one who wills. Everything emanates from him. Nothing surrounds him, because whatever exists, it's okay, he wills that existence. So the more the Jew emulates God and displays a semblance of God's behavior versus this existence, the greater he assumes those characteristics of God. You become unaffected. As God affects and is unaffected, the more you cleave to Torah and the more you live that life, breadth-wise, depth-wise, and qualitative-wise, you become that spiritual being and you become the unaffected person, although you're a human being. Moshe Rabbeinu being the epitome, the apex of what the human being is meant to be, the Torah confirms, he is that. Proof of the pudding is his vibrancy at the end of his life, even in the grave, was not diminished. His sight, the only thing that was lacking was his soul, because his soul departed from him. But outside of that, his body was fully intact. Intact as if he was alive. So this is this tenet of Judaism. Firstly, God is not a body. In whatever context you want to say body is. Physical body, spiritual body. And whatever affects any entity, he cannot be affected by that. He's not subject to that. And there's nothing comparable to him. There's no semblance of anything comparable to what he is. At Sinai, we were given an ultimatum, a choice. Either accept my Torah or be buried under the mountain. And what does it mean being buried under the mountain? In the words of the Midrash, and the world would revert back to pre-existence. Pre-Nilo. It'll go back to pre-existence. It'll go back to nothingness. Whatever nothingness means. As I said, it doesn't mean a vacuum. It doesn't mean destruction. Meaning the only thing that will exist then is only God's existence. Nothing will exist outside of God. That's what's going to happen. Again, why? Because why did God initially will existence? That man should be a beneficiary of his goodness. But if the only way man could be the ultimate beneficiary, to cleave to him, you have to achieve a level of spirituality through your own initiative, which is only through his wisdom, known as the Torah. So if no nation accepts that, or the other nations are qualified, how are we able to achieve that level of worthiness to be a beneficiary of that goodness? Therefore, God says, if that's the case, if the Jews don't accept the Torah, existence comes to an end. Everything reverts back to pre-existence. That means the objective of creation wasn't met. Because the objective is to receive the Torah, because only through the Torah you assume that spiritual profile to have a capacity to be the beneficiary of the ultimate good, which is relation with God. But if you're only that physical being, and you're not able to achieve that special level through the observance of Torah, through making all those choices and those initiatives, so if that's the case, you're never going to be the beneficiary of that goodness that God wanted you to be. So if that's the case, the project never succeeds, never comes to fruition. If that's the case, God says it's over. We go back to pre-existence. And pre-existence is pre-ex nihilo. It's meaning nothing, which truly means nothing whatsoever. Only God will exist in that existence. Now, everybody has his own ideas based on his own level of, you want to call it, foolishness, audacity, brazenness, arrogance, whatever you want to call it. We say there's no semblance of God. Well, I think there is. Now, especially if you have a lot of money, you could say there is. Who's going to tell you differently? Now, many people assume positions and they force their position on someone else, although it's not founded whatsoever. I always give out the story in the Talmud in Avodah Zarah where the emperor says to the great rabbi, there's a Roman emperor, God says you can't count the stars of heaven, they're too numerous. So he says to the great rabbi of the Mishnah period, but I can. Although God says you can't, I know the number of stars. Okay? Rabbi is a very smart person. And he says to him, he says, by the way, how many teeth do you have in your mouth? So he puts his fingers in his mouth. He starts counting the teeth from the back to the front. And he says, this is many eyes I have. So he says to the emperor, he says, I want to ask the emperor, your Highness, a question. It's tell me you know how many stars are in heaven. When I ask you how many teeth you have in your mouth, which is within your grasp, you have to put your finger in your mouth to count your teeth. So if you don't know how many teeth you have in your mouth, how are we supposed to know how many stars are in heaven? But we delude ourselves. You have no idea what God is. He has no body. He has no semblance of body. He's unfathomable. Well, I think I could fathom. In my mind, he's this. Look, something. You could dream whatever you want, and you could delude yourself whatever you want, and you could say whatever you want. But factually, these are fundamentals which are absolutes, irrefutable fundamentals. Because I said all these fundamentals go back to reality, to Sinai, where Sinai was a reality of fact. It was a confirmation of fact, because God, as the creator, opened heavens and earth and showed the Jewish people in that wake state of communication what the reality of existence was. And that's exactly where all this we're speaking now is rooted in that communication at Sinai, which was the Torah itself at that particular moment in history. We speak about infinite. What is infinite? There's no beginning, there's no end. And we can't even fathom, because even things that are finite, we can't fathom. I always give the example. Space. Existence has limitation. You go to space, it's endless. 1 million miles, 2 million miles, 3 million miles. It's endless. So where does it end? Evidently end somewhere. But something, it's so out of our grasp, because our frame of reference is something which we could somehow think about or visualize. It's beyond visualization. And because it's beyond visualization, we can't even relate to what it is. It's even something that's finite, but it's beyond any frame of reference. And therefore, it has no relevance to visualization. So how are you supposed to fathom or have any relevance to having the inkling of what infinite is? Not. But it's important to know, even though you cannot fathom it, but it's important to know that there's a difference. The difference is because if you believe in God, and God is infinite, which tells you everything is contained within himself, and he wills that, that's infinite. Finite means, although you can't fathom the degree of finite of the world because it's so extensive and so out there and unlimited, although it's finite. So if you can't fathom that, you can't fathom God. It's what we call kal v'chomer. That's a logical concept that if the lesser you can't fathom, you definitely can't fathom the greater. That's what it's about. We say Hashem is Rishon U'Achron. He's first and he's last. He's the first and he's the last. What does that mean? He's the first and he's the last. Nobody preceded him. Nobody follows him. What is it when we say nobody preceded him? In what sense? Was the one cell animal before God? Was there anything before God? Something on the most advanced microscopic level, on the atomic level. Nothing preceded God. He's the first. So what does that mean? He's the first. That means everything emanates from him. He is the foundation. He's the bedrock of all existence. And whatever does exist, it's because he caused it to exist. That's cause and effect. Okay, we're going to stop here today. 1 second.